I'm Irene Caldwell.
72 years old, and the night my daughter dragged me out by my hair. Her husband had already punched me in the face. It happened on the front steps with the porch light flickering behind them and the smell of barbecue smoke still in the air. I was bleeding from my lip, and my cardigan was torn. But what they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe months. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I just sat there on the curb, under that useless swing, shivering and watching the door close. And with it, something inside me finally clicked into place. Before I go any further, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to keep your head high when someone tried to take your peace. I moved in with Valerie the week after my 72nd birthday. Not because I couldn't live alone, but because she said she missed me. Said the kids wanted to hear my stories again. Said even Marcus thought it would be good for me.
They'd just moved into a house outside Des Moines with white siding and a long front porch. And she kept saying it would feel like coming home. She'd even redone the guest room in lavender and soft cream colors and placed a photo of us by the nightstand from when she graduated high school. I still had the framed copy too, sitting quietly on a bookshelf back at my old apartment. I'd lived 2 towns over in a small second-floor walk-up near the college library where I worked part-time, sorting historical archives and leading genealogy workshops. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A tidy kitchen with yellow tiles and the ceramic owl salt shakers my husband and I had bought at a yard sale 30 years earlier. I liked the rhythm of my days there, the quiet, the independence, the way my space held memory without asking anything of me. But Valerie had said she wanted me closer, said she missed our dinners together, and how the house didn't feel right without my voice in it, and when she smiled like that, well, I wanted to believe it was true. Those first few days felt warm. She brewed me chamomile tea before bed, and Marcus asked polite questions about my old library projects. The kids curled up near my feet as I told them about our family's journey from Kentucky, farmland to Iowa, prairies, and for a while, I let myself think maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she really had missed me. But by the end of the second week, little things started to shift, not in ways you'd notice at first, just small comments about expenses, rising a joke about how retirement must feel comfortable when bills were due, or how college was closer than we thought. She always said it lightly, but her eyes held something else. Then came the folder, one afternoon, as I folded laundry. She walked into my room and handed it to me, like it was a recipe. Card inside were bank forms, my own investment statements, and a notary sheet already half filled. She sat beside me on the bed, her voice soft and measured, saying they only needed a short-term transfer, just 6 months, enough to lock in a real estate deal that could help with tuition and household upgrades. I remember asking her how she got my account information, and without blinking, she said she'd always known. My passwords said she needed to check on things sometimes, in case I ever slipped. That night, I stared up at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow circles above me, and something inside me turned with it. A thought I didn't want to finish. A question I didn't want to ask. Had all this been kindness, or had it been calculation? I didn't sleep. I just lay there remembering all the small ways I had helped her through the years. How I'd loaned her money for her transmission when she was 23 and never asked for it back. How I'd taken care of Lily and Ethan when she and Marcus had business dinners or late nights at the office. But now, sitting in that quiet room with that folder on my nightstand, it hit me. This wasn't about family. This was about access. The next morning she made me tea again, but I didn't drink it. I just watched the steam curl upward and felt something cold begin to settle around my ribs. Not fear, not yet, but a quiet knowing that the version of my daughter I'd moved in to reconnect with might not be the one who actually lived in that house. And as I turned the envelope over in my hands and heard Marcus's voice downstairs talking numbers into his phone, I realized this wasn't a homecoming. It was an opening move. The morning after Valerie handed me the folder with the transfer forms, she acted like nothing had happened. She offered me coffee, asked if I needed anything from the store mentioned. Lily had a book report due. I nodded and stirred cream into my cup, but the spoon clinked harder than usual. I hadn't slept much, and the air in the house felt different, colder. The lavender room upstairs didn't hold the same quiet. It once had. The photo on the nightstand looked like it belonged to someone else. Now, someone more naive. Someone who didn't think her passwords had been memorized for years later that week. Marcus brought up the investment again, this time while slicing grilled chicken at dinner. He said one of his clients had already doubled their return, and it wasn't too late to join in. I listened without answering. Valerie chimed in, said 6 months wasn't long, and that they'd put everything back as soon as the sale closed. Then she smiled across the table and said it would mean a lot to the kids, too, help secure their future. Ethan looked up mid-chew, confused. Lily asked if she could be excused early to finish her project. No one noticed when I placed my napkin down and quietly left the table. The next day, I found a grocery receipt on the counter with certain items circled in red ink. Beside it was a sticky note with one line written neatly. Your share. Thanks. No greeting. No smile. Just numbers. I didn't say anything. I just folded the paper and placed it in the drawer by the fridge that evening. Valerie handed me a printed sheet with columns of utility costs, electricity, gas, water, and at the bottom in bold was my name and a total. She said, fairness kept things clear, said it was better for everyone when expectations were written down. Marcus nodded while scrolling on his phone. I carried the paper upstairs and stared at it on the bed. The amount wasn't unreasonable, but the message came through loud and clear. They didn't want a mother in their home. They wanted a renter. 2 days later, I walked into the kitchen and found Marcus flipping through a black notebook. When he noticed me, he snapped it closed too quickly. Smiled, said he was just checking his schedule. I watched him set it down, then turned toward the pantry as if nothing had happened later that night when they were out. I checked the drawer where I kept my folder. The tabs had been shifted, and a few pages looked slightly bent. I didn't need confirmation. My gut had already told me what my eyes now showed. Something was being planned, and I wasn't meant to know the following morning. Over breakfast, Valerie asked if I'd ever considered simplifying my estate, she said. Joint accounts made emergencies easier. Said her friend's mother had done something similar, so her kids wouldn't have to worry later. Marcus added that he could help draft the paperwork. Said he had templates from work and could make everything smooth. I didn't answer. I looked down at my cereal. The milk had gone lukewarm, and the spoon suddenly felt too heavy to lift. That same afternoon, I drove to the edge of town and parked near the library before dialing my financial advisor. I didn't want to speak in the house. I told him to block all changes, flag suspicious activity, and send alerts for every transaction. He asked if I was okay, I said. It was precaution, nothing more. I could hear his hesitation, but he agreed to everything without pressing by the end of the week. Valerie handed me a packet with sample paperwork. She said she'd drafted it to get the ball rolling. She smiled and said, No rush, just wanted to help. She didn't look away as she said it. I placed the envelope beside my tea and asked about Lily's math grade. She dropped the subject, but 2 days later, Marcus mentioned it again, this time in the garage while I was taking out recycling. He said, Valerie had a good heart, that I was lucky to have a daughter who cared so much. Then he added that money only caused tension when people kept secrets. He smiled too long as he said it. I walked past him without a word and locked my door as soon as I was upstairs. That night, I changed every password. I had scanned old documents and saved backups to a flash drive, which I tucked into the lining of my suitcase. I wrote down the names of the people I trusted and stored their numbers in a notebook that never left my nightstand. I wasn't afraid, not yet, but I was beginning to prepare. I didn't call it paranoia, just pattern recognition, and I'd learned over the years to trust the feeling when something wasn't right. As the 4th week approached, things inside the house grew tense. The grandkids no longer came to my room in the evenings. Valerie stopped asking about my day. Marcus's footsteps in the hallway began to feel like warning bells. One morning, I found my pill organizer on top of the dresser instead of under my bed. The Tuesday slot was already empty, but I hadn't taken anything yet. I threw out the whole week and started fresh from my travel stash. From then on, I carried my essentials in a zip pouch that stayed with me. I stopped leaving drinks unattended, and I didn't accept anything unless I prepared it myself. One afternoon, from the back window, I heard Marcus talking too loudly on the phone. He was pacing near the shed, and though I couldn't catch every word, I heard enough equity, refinancing guardianship. I watched him through the screen, and something in my chest tightened again. Later, Valerie asked if I'd signed some routine refinance paperwork. When I glanced at the forms, my name was listed as a co-owner on a secondary mortgage. She brushed it off, said it was a clerical error, but her voice didn't carry surprise, just patience, like she'd expected the question that night. I retrieved the flash drive and reviewed the trust documents my husband and I had signed years ago. Everything had been kept separate after he passed. That was always the plan. They didn't know about the accounts I kept overseas, or the condo under a different name. They assumed the condo and one retirement account were all I had. They didn't realize I had prepared for this possibility, long before any of them thought to ask. The next day, I went to the bank in person, met with the manager, showed them my ID, and asked for a full review of access attempts. They found 2 failed logins, both traced to an IP from Marcus's company. I asked them to tighten every layer of security biometric in-person verification. Voice? ID, they didn't ask questions. They just did it when I got home. Dinner was on the table. Roast pork, overcooked carrots. Marcus asked how my day had been. I said, I took a walk. He smiled and passed the salt, like everything was fine. 3 days later, I returned from the grocery store and found my room torn apart. Drawers pulled open, lining cut from my coat pockets. Flipped, the flash drive was gone. I stood still for a long moment before walking down the stairs. Valerie was in the kitchen. She didn't look up. Marcus stood by the fridge, arms crossed. I asked if someone had gone into my room. Valerie said. Maybe Ethan had been looking for something, Marcus said. Maybe I had just misplaced things. They answered too quickly. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and pulled out the old burner phone I'd kept behind the bookshelf years ago. My husband and I had used it during a property scam we'd once been caught in. I called my lawyer. Gave him the code word, and within minutes, he had locked down everything, revoked any shared authority, triggered the fail-safe clauses in my trust, and filed a soft alert with Adult Protective Services, just in case I didn't accuse anyone yet, but I needed it. On record that evening, I packed an overnight bag, told Valerie I was going out for a walk. She didn't stop me. A black sedan pulled up at the corner of the block. My attorney had sent a driver. We headed straight to a safe house in Ames deeded under a former college friend who owed me a favor. By the time the sun set, every joint account had been frozen. Every asset moved to a protected trust that no one could touch. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. I stayed in that small house in Ames for 3 days with the curtains drawn and the doors locked. Not because I felt afraid, but because the silence gave me room to think. I made tea in the mornings, peppermint mostly, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad jotting notes as they came to me. Phone calls, dates, exact times of conversations. Everything I could remember, I wasn't sure what would be needed later, so I recorded it all. Even the things that seemed too small to matter. Like how often Valerie brought up joint accounts, or how Marcus kept finding reasons to linger near my room when I wasn't inside. On the 3rd evening, my lawyer called to confirm the new trust structure had been finalized. Everything was moved offshore in a configuration that couldn't be altered without my in-person signature. We'd added 2 successor trustees, both women from my old reading group, Claire and Barbara, retired educators I had known for years. Their names were now on file. Should anything ever happen to me, it gave me a strange sense of steadiness, knowing that if my voice was ever silenced, someone I trusted would still speak for me. On the fourth morning, an email arrived from the bank. There had been another attempt to access one of my accounts using outdated credentials. Then a second message followed this one from my lawyer saying, Adult Protective Services had officially opened a quiet inquiry. The case wasn't public. No accusations, just a formal record of concern with my supporting documentation already attached. A few hours later, I drove to my friend Patrice's home on the east side of town. She opened the door without asking questions, just wrapped me in a hug and pointed to the casserole warming in the oven. That night, I sat on her back porch with a wool blanket over my shoulders, listening to the crickets and letting the dark settle around me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the need to look behind me. The next morning, Patrice helped me find a short-term lease on a 2-bedroom condo near a local park. The space was clean, quiet, with big windows and pale green walls. I moved in that Friday with just 2 suitcases and a few framed photos. The rest could come later, or not at all. The following week, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old address. It was from a law firm representing Valerie and Marcus. The tone was stiff formal. They expressed concern over my sudden absence and requested a meeting to discuss a revised estate structure. They claimed I might be under undue influence from unnamed individuals and suggested I was mentally compromised. The letter referenced my age more than once, my supposed confusion, and an incident at a neighborhood gathering where I had allegedly repeated myself several times. I read it twice before handing it to my attorney. He read it without comment, then picked up a pen and began marking lines on the margin, highlighting phrases that would be useful in our reply. We included recent cognitive evaluations from my doctor's statements, from 3 church committee members I'd worked with for over 6 years, and letters from my financial advisor and neighbors, each one attesting to my clarity and independence. At the end, we attached a copy of the log my lawyer had compiled, showing every access attempt, every red flag, and every conversation I had recorded 2 days later. We received a call from a detective in the Financial Crimes Division. The bank had flagged the login attempts as part of a larger investigation into elder exploitation. The detective said, both Marcus and Valerie had been mentioned in other reports, nothing concrete yet, but enough to connect patterns. He asked if I'd be willing to speak on record if needed. I said yes. That evening, Patrice brought over soup and we sat at my kitchen table. She asked if I'd ever thought about writing a letter to the judge, not a legal document, but something personal. Something that told the story in my own words I hadn't. But the next morning, I pulled out a pen and began. I wrote about Valerie's childhood, about the way she used to braid my hair on Sunday afternoons, and how we would sit on the porch reading picture books together. I wrote about the day she left for college and the tears we both tried not to show. I didn't write anything bitter, just truth. How over time the space between us had widened. Not all at once, but in quiet moments, in skipped phone calls and unanswered invitations. I ended the letter by saying that choosing to protect myself hadn't been easy, but it had become necessary, not out of anger, but from a need for peace. My attorney typed it up and submitted it with the rest of our response. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. During those weeks, I kept to myself. The phone rang, sometimes old friends leaving voicemails asking what they'd heard. In whispers was true. I didn't return the calls, not yet. The story wasn't finished, and I wasn't ready to narrate it to anyone else on the morning of the hearing. I wore a navy blazer and the same shoes I'd worn to my husband's memorial. I didn't carry a bag, just a folder with my name on it and a steady heartbeat. The courtroom was colder than expected. Valerie and Marcus sat across from me. She didn't meet my eyes. Marcus glanced over once, then turned back to his phone. Their lawyer opened by repeating what the letter had claimed, that I was confused, isolated, easily manipulated. Then he introduced their witnesses, 2 acquaintances from their church who spoke vaguely about my forgetfulness, about a barbecue where I'd asked the same question more than once when it was our turn. My attorney began with the evaluations and moved through the timeline. Clearly, step by step. He spoke without emotion, just facts. He placed my letter on the record and handed a copy to the judge. She read it slowly at the bench, then looked up and said it was rare to see such clarity from someone being accused of incapacity. She dismissed the petition without delay, called it not just unfounded, but an abuse of process, and referred the matter to be reviewed further. We walked out without speaking to Valerie or Marcus. There was nothing left to say. Back at home, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and let the sunlight fall across my hands. A few hours later, an email arrived from a women's advocacy group. Someone from the courthouse had shared my letter. They asked if I'd be willing to speak at a local forum. Not about the case, but about resilience and finding your voice again. I didn't answer right away, but the invitation stayed open, and something about it lingered, because maybe part of healing was letting the truth reach farther than the room it was born in. Maybe that letter wasn't just for the judge. The week after the hearing felt strange, not quiet exactly, more like suspended time. I stayed close to home, answered only necessary calls, and spent most mornings walking the loop around the park near my condo. The sun had started to come up earlier, and the light hit the sidewalk in long golden streaks. I carried a thermos of tea and let the sound of passing birds fill the space that used to hold worry one afternoon while sorting through old paperwork. I came across the file from the Nina Trust tucked neatly behind a manila envelope. The name still felt new. Even though I'd said it aloud a dozen times, I'd named it after my grandmother, Eleanor Lena Caldwell, the woman who raised 3 children through the Dust Bowl on nothing but grit and canned peaches. I sat with that file for a while, reading through the original charter clauses, the way the interest would be distributed each year to women over 65 who had experienced financial abuse from someone in their own family. My lawyer had drawn it up quickly but thoroughly, and now the fund was alive. The first round of applications had already been reviewed by Claire and Barbara, who had taken to the role of co-trustees, like they'd been waiting their whole lives for it. I didn't plan to be involved much, just the founder on paper. But every time they sent an update, I read every word. 3 days later, Patrice dropped off groceries and a binder thick with new proposals. The board wanted to expand more outreach, more applicants, even a partnership with a nearby college that offered courses in financial literacy for older women. I flipped through the pages slowly and paused when I reached the section labeled Speaker Series. It listed names, dates, proposed topics, and at the very bottom, penciled in lightly, was my own name. I didn't say yes right away, but I didn't cross it out either. Instead, I went back to my usual routine: morning walks, long afternoons, tending to the balcony plants, and the occasional quiet evening on the phone with Claire or Barbara, just checking in. I didn't hear from Valerie or Marcus, not after the hearing. Not even a letter for a while. That felt like the cleanest kind of closure. But then one morning, I checked the mail and found a thick envelope, no return address. Just my name, written in clean, careful handwriting. The kind Valerie had learned in Catholic school back when I still packed her lunch and braided her hair. Before picture day, inside was a single sheet folded twice. She said she'd read the articles, seen my name in the paper, and heard about the trust from someone in their neighborhood. She wrote that she knew she'd gone too far, that Marcus had pushed and she'd followed, and that she couldn't undo it. But she wanted to talk. She suggested dinner, just the 2 of us at a restaurant near the courthouse this Friday at 7. I placed the letter on the counter and boiled water for tea. I didn't need to think long. I wasn't going, but I didn't throw it away either. On Friday evening, as the light shifted across the living room floor, I remembered the time she'd written in the letter and checked the clock. It was just past 7:30. The phone rang once, then again, unknown number. Both times, I let it go to voicemail. The third time, I answered. It was a nurse from the hospital. Valerie had been admitted with chest pains. They'd listed me as her emergency contact. She was stable, but alone, and asking for me. I stood there, holding the phone against my ear, while the nurse waited, and somewhere in the background, a monitor beeped. In steady time, I asked if she was alert. The nurse said yes. I said I'd be there shortly and hung up. I didn't feel hurried. I just changed clothes, grabbed my coat, and drove the 12 minutes it took to reach the hospital. The room was dim when I walked in. Valerie looked smaller than I remembered. Hair pulled back loosely, hands folded on the blanket. She turned her head when I stepped inside and blinked twice before whispering my name. I didn't speak, just moved the chair closer and sat down. The nurse nodded once before quietly pulling the door shut behind her. We sat in silence for several minutes. Then Valerie spoke. She said she'd read everything, the articles, the statements, even the affidavits from the hearing. She said she hadn't realized how far she'd gone, how much she'd allowed herself to believe. It was just about protection, she said. Marcus had convinced her it was for the best, but that somewhere along the way she stopped seeing me and only saw the paperwork. Then she asked if I'd created the Alela Nina Trust as a message for her. I told her no. It was never about punishment. It was about giving breath back to the women who had it taken. She didn't cry, but her eyes filled. She said she couldn't fix what she'd done, but wanted to begin again. Not as mother and daughter, maybe just as two people who once knew each other better than anyone. I stood slowly, not to leave in anger, just because it felt like the moment had settled. I told her I didn't hate her, but I didn't belong to her anymore. My peace wasn't something tied to her remorse. Then I walked out. The sky outside was the color of navy linen, and the air had cooled. I stood in the parking lot for a minute, just breathing back home. I made soup, lit a candle, and slept the whole night through without waking. For the first time in years, the next morning, the mail came earlier than usual. The postman walked right to my door and handed me a large envelope from the U.S. Attorney's office. Inside was a formal notice. Federal charges were being brought against Marcus. The list was long: identity theft, financial coercion, elder abuse. My name appeared more than once, not just as a complainant, but as a key witness. I sat down and read each line carefully, then again slower. At the end of the document was a sealed note. The original audit had started months earlier, triggered by an anonymous tip sent directly to the IRS. The person who submitted it had access to internal documents, knew what to flag, and had included details. Only someone inside the household would know the tip had come from Valerie. She had turned him in before the dinner, before the hospital. Before I ever answered the phone, I didn't know why, and maybe it didn't matter. But she had cracked open the very thing she once helped build. I folded the letter slowly and placed it on the desk beside the seed catalogs. Spring was coming, and I thought I might try tomatoes again. 3 days after the letter from the attorney's office arrived, a plain sedan pulled into my driveway. The man who stepped out wore no uniform, just khakis and a dark windbreaker. But when he opened his wallet, the badge inside was real. He introduced himself as federal investigator. Daniel Keene said he was following up on a broader investigation into financial exploitation cases in our county, and that my name had come up more than once. Not as a victim, he said, but as someone who understood how to build a paper trail. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee between us, and no distractions. He asked thoughtful questions. Nothing rushed. He wanted to understand how Valerie and Marcus had gained access to my accounts, how the conversations had shifted, how the documents had been introduced. Not all at once, but slowly. He didn't write everything down, just listened closely, pausing when something in my story didn't quite line up with the timeline they already had. I gave him what I had: bank statements, emails, dates of conversations, printouts from my trust documents, and copies of the communication. Valerie had sent the original folder, the refinance packet, the unsigned transfer of authority form. And then I told him about the drawer, the morning I found my coat lining torn and the flash drive missing. He nodded quietly, said the kind of detail that sounds small but means a lot in court. Before he left, He told me they had subpoenaed the bank for phone recordings tied to attempted wire transfers. One of them had a man identifying himself as my son-in-law, giving my full name and social security number. But there was no recorded permission on file, just background static, and a voice they now believed was Marcus's. It wouldn't be enough for conviction alone, but paired with the trust documents, the fraudulent notary attempts, and Valerie's anonymous tip, it created a pattern. One, they were starting to understand in full. That evening, Patrice came by again. She brought a new folder, this one from the board of the Elelanina Trust, a stack of reports, volunteer applications, grant recommendations, and a draft proposal for an outreach initiative in partnership with a local university. The proposal included not just financial literacy, but digital security, training, and legal rights workshops. I read every page and paused when I saw the line about a speaker series. Again, my name was now listed as the tentative keynote. I didn't respond right away, just placed the paper aside and made us tea, while Patrice sliced peaches in the kitchen. The next morning, I went for a long walk past the community garden and the pond where kids threw bread for ducks. I sat on a bench and thought about the stories I'd read in the early applications. Women who had lost everything and still managed to crawl forward slowly, quietly, with their heads high and their names intact. 2 weeks later, I agreed to speak at the first small gathering. The event was held in the basement of the local library. Folding chairs, stale coffee, and paper napkins. No microphones, no cameras. I stood at the front of the room in a soft gray sweater and spoke not about the hearing or the trust or even the hospital, just about dignity, about recognizing when the air around you shifts and someone you love begins to take from you in ways you can't name right away. I told them I was 72, that I had raised a daughter I loved more than I ever understood, and that I watched her slip away, not with a fight, but with 100 quiet choices one by one, until I couldn't find her anymore. I told them about the drawer and the flash drive, about walking out the front door with nothing but a small bag and a name I refused to give up. There were no gasps, no applause, just stillness. A few women wiped their eyes, but no one moved until I stepped down. Then a woman with white hair and a green scarf took my hand. Her name was Eloise. She said she was 76, that her daughter had taken out a home equity loan in her name and disappeared. She hadn't told anyone until that night when I drove home. I kept the window cracked just enough to feel the early summer breeze. I didn't turn on the radio or answer my phone. I let the quiet fill the space, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel heavy, just full by midsummer. The name, Elelanina, began to circle through small community spaces. Flyers tacked to grocery store boards, announcements slipped into church newsletters. Nothing flashy, just steady word of mouth. I spoke at 3 more events over the next month, never reading from a page, never rehearsing, just telling the truth in pieces and letting the silence hold what didn't need to be said. Then one afternoon, a call came from Claire. They had received a letter from a journalism student at the state university. She was studying nonprofit leadership and wanted to intern with the trust her grandmother had been one of the first women we'd granted support to. And she said that letter had changed everything. She asked if I'd be willing to meet her, and I said yes. We met the following Friday at a coffee shop near the courthouse. She was 22, sharp eyes, steady voice, and a notepad already full of questions. I answered everything I could, then watched as she opened her laptop and began outlining a plan for social outreach, budget tracking, and volunteer coordination. Her hands moved fast, but her voice was calm and deliberate, like someone who already knew this work would matter after she left. I walked the long way home past the old post office and the park bench, where Valerie once taught Lily to tie her shoes. The wind had picked up, and the trees cast long shadows across the sidewalk. When I reached my door, I stood for a moment and realized something I hadn't thought about Valerie or Marcus in hours. Not from fear, not from anger. They were no longer living rent-free in my mind that night as I sat at the kitchen table filing paperwork for the trust. I heard the mail slot click, A letter slid across the floor. Thick cream paper. No return address. Just my name in. Valerie's handwriting inside was a single photograph, her holding Lily years ago, both of them smiling. The edges of the photo were worn soft, like someone had held it often. I didn't cry, and I didn't throw it away. I placed it in the drawer beside my checkbook. The one I don't open often, but never forget. Is there a few mornings after the photo arrived? I brewed my coffee a little stronger than usual. It was the kind that clings to your throat just enough to wake you all the way up. The air outside was still, and the light through the window carried that early spring softness, like the world hadn't quite decided to start yet. Then a knock came at the door, soft but steady. When I opened it, a courier stood on the step holding an envelope thick with legal weight. It was from my attorney. I sat down before opening it and let my hands settle over the flap. The letter confirmed something I hadn't expected months earlier before the confrontation. Before the hearing, I had signed a document I didn't remember. It had been disguised as routine trust consolidation. Marcus had printed it from his office and said it would make things easier for tax season. I had glanced at the pages but never truly reviewed them, not closely enough. The form gave limited authority to move assets into a joint structure under his control, and just enough access to begin the process of transfer. The only reason it hadn't gone through was because of a flagged alert set in motion by the bank weeks later. When I activated the fraud protections, my lawyer had requested full records from the financial institution, including internal notes and timeline tags. And in that stack of records was something else. Valerie's name had been listed as a conditional beneficiary on a secondary clause, one that would only activate upon medical confirmation of my incapacity. I folded the document and let it rest beside me on the couch. The timing matched a fall I'd had months earlier before everything started to unravel. I had dismissed it as clumsiness. A slip on the stairs, the bruise on my collarbone, the dizziness, the pill bottle. I didn't remember opening. All of it had seemed like nothing at the time, until it wasn't. My attorney had written a note at the bottom in blue ink. Just a line. He had checked my medical records, and the incident matched the date. The document had been notarized. Someone had expected me not to recover. Someone had quietly built a future based on my absence. I stepped outside and let the wind press against my face. It was sharper than expected, but I didn't pull away. I walked the edge of the yard and looked at the old planter box near the fence, still bare from winter. In that moment, I thought of all the meals I had cooked for Valerie when she was a child. Casseroles, chicken soup, baked apples. The quiet afternoons after her father died, when we sat together. Not saying much, but never far from one another. She had never known what I gave up in those years. That was the point she wasn't supposed to. But now, the woman she had become had signed her name to my erasure, and Marcus had orchestrated the rest like it was some inevitable calculation. The next morning, I visited the courthouse, not for a hearing, not to testify, just to feel the ground where the next decision would land. My attorney had already filed the formal request to nullify the unauthorized documents he had. The trail, the signatures, the medical confirmation, and the protection clauses still intact. The court clerk recognized my name and nodded as she stamped the paperwork quietly. When I stepped back outside, the sky was clear, not warm yet, but clean. I walked to the bench across from the courthouse and sat for a while with a thermos of tea in my lap. I didn't need applause or confirmation, just the knowledge that this part was nearly closed. The court would reverse the unauthorized transfers, unfreeze the accounts, and reinstate my sole authority as trustee and beneficiary. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from Marcus. His voice was lower than I remembered. He said, he was sorry. Said he understood. Now, said Valerie wanted to speak. I deleted it without saving the message. A few days after that, A manila envelope appeared on my doorstep. Inside was a photograph worn around the edges. Valerie holding Lily back when she was small. Her smile wide and unguarded. The kind you can't fake. I didn't cry, and I didn't toss it out. I placed it in the drawer with the others. The one I rarely opened later that night. I sat on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl. The air was cool enough to bite just slightly, and I listened to the soft rustle of leaves. No cars, no voices. No one behind me for the first time in years. The silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. The following Thursday, I returned to the courthouse one last time. Not for a hearing, but to sign the final documents confirming the annulment of the invalid trust, the reinstatement of full control, and the return of frozen assets. The judge reviewed everything in chambers. No drama, no delay. It was done. My name, my legal status, my authority, all fully restored. When I stepped out of the building, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm. I walked home, slowly, past the florist, the bakery with the dusty window display, and the old bookstore I used to take Valerie to when she was little. The wind caught my scarf, and I tightened it around my shoulders. That afternoon, I planted 2 trays of pansies, purple and white, hardy things. They never look like much when they go into the ground, but they hold up through cold better than most. They bloom even after frost, 3 days after the final paperwork was filed. I received another call. This time, it wasn't from my attorney or the courthouse. It was April. Her voice was quiet, not trembling, just stripped down. She said, the federal agents had come by earlier that afternoon. Marcus hadn't said a word, just packed a suitcase and walked out. She didn't know where he was going, only that he didn't slam the door. This time she said she was sorry again, but it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like release. I didn't say much. I let the silence carry most of it after the call ended. I walked outside, wrapped my shawl a little tighter, and stood beneath the porch light. It was just starting to flicker again. Not broken, just old. I leaned against the railing and listened. No voices, no keys jangling, no steps behind me. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be. The following morning, a letter came from my attorney. Inside was a second copy of the trust annulment final, stamped and notarized beneath it. A short note he had added in pen. A reminder that this version of my name was now the only one that mattered. The one untouched, the one unchallenged. I spent the afternoon walking through the house, touching the edges of door frames, the drawer that always stuck when the weather turned damp, the chipped tea kettle I'd had since my early 40s. These were the things they never tried to take, the parts they didn't even see that night. I opened the journal I had tucked in the drawer by the couch, the one I'd started after leaving their house months ago. I flipped past the early pages full of notes, timelines, questions, and stopped at a blank sheet. I wrote about the walk, the quiet, the deep breath that didn't feel borrowed the next morning. The phone rang again. This time, I let it go to voicemail. It was April, she said. Marcus had been served. She didn't go into details. Just said she wanted me to know that she wasn't going with him this time, that he had crossed a line too far even for her. And then at the end of the message, she said something else. She said she understood now why I had walked away. I didn't return the call. Instead, I made soup and sorted receipts for the Alela Nina Trust. We had our next grant cycle coming up, and Claire had sent a list of applicants to review women from all over the state, most of them older than me, some younger, all of them carrying stories shaped by someone else's control. That evening, I sat on the porch and looked through the list. Not as a victim, not as someone trying to heal, just as someone doing the work. The sky turned that deep blue. that only shows up right before summer settles in. And I felt it, something settle in me too. Not forgiveness, exactly, not forgetting, just space. Space between what happened and what came after. A few days later, Patrice came by. She brought a loaf of bread and a binder full of updates. From the board inside was a new section draft, notes for a storytelling series. Small events hosted in libraries and community centers, places where older women could speak without being rushed or explained away. They had penciled in my name again, not to headline, not to teach, just to open the door. I didn't say yes right away. I just placed the binder on the table and thanked her. That night, I sat by the window with a blanket over my lap and watched the wind shift the curtains. The house was quiet, but not hollow. Just still, the kind of stillness that comes after standing up for yourself, even if your voice shakes at first. That weekend, I walked through the farmer's market near the courthouse. A few people nodded as I passed. One or two looked like they might say something, but didn't. I picked up a bundle of rosemary and 2 loaves of sourdough and made my way home slowly. At the corner of my street, a little girl waved at me from a porch swing. Her grandmother sat behind her knitting in silence. It felt like something full circle. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the Regional Office of Elder Protection Services. The investigation had been escalated with the support of federal findings and multiple testimonies, including Valerie's. What had started as an isolated report had grown into something larger: patterns of financial grooming and quiet coercion across several households. My case would be part of the presentation to lawmakers. The following quarter, not as a statistic, but as a story with a name attached. Didn't cry. I just closed the laptop and stood up, made tea, and opened the windows for the first time in months. The breeze didn't carry weight. It carried breath, air that belonged to me alone. That evening I stood on the porch again. The light above me steady now. Marcus hadn't called since the summons, and Valerie hadn't pushed past silence. Instead, there was space between us, not sharp, just wide enough for me to breathe. The last thing I did before going to bed was take the photo she'd sent me, the one of her holding Lily. I slipped it into a frame and placed it on a shelf, not on the mantel, not front and center, just there, quietly tucked between a jar of sea glass and a clock that still worked. Spring settled in slowly, the last traces of frost fading from the flower beds outside my window. One morning, I found myself making tea in the quiet house. Sunlight spilling over the kitchen counter, the old clock ticking steady in the background. I thought about how far things had come since I left Valerie and Marcus's house. How each small act of reclaiming my life had pieced me back together day by day. The investigations wrapped up just as the lilacs bloomed. Federal charges went forward, and though there were no big headlines, the right people took notice. Marcus faced consequences for what he'd done, and Valerie chose to start over on her own. There were no more angry calls, no attempts to rewrite the past, just distance that held its own kind of peace. Lily and Ethan sometimes sent postcards with drawings or a few shy words. I pinned them to the side of the refrigerator, right beside the grocery lists and the recipes I loved most. The Alelanina Trust began to grow in quiet ways. Claire and Barbara sent stories from the women we'd helped some with. Nothing but a first name, others willing to stand in front of a room and share their journey. The grant cycle became a new rhythm for me, a reminder that healing can ripple out farther than you ever expect. I spoke at 2 more gatherings, each time a little steadier, each time letting go of the hurt that used to live under my skin. On one soft evening, I took a walk through my neighborhood, the air warm and fragrant with the first signs of summer. I passed by families on their porches, a grandmother rocking a grandchild, a couple sharing quiet conversation, and I realized that survival wasn't just about outlasting the storm. It was about what you chose to build. In the silence afterward, Valerie wrote once more a short note tucked into a plain envelope. She said she hoped I was well, that she had begun counseling, that she was trying to understand the choices she'd made. I read it and placed it in the same drawer with her old photo. I no longer felt the ache, just a gentle sorrow for what we'd both lost, and a hope that she might one day find her own peace. As I watered the pansies by the back step, I let myself be grateful, not just for justice, but for dignity, for the steadying power of quiet resolve, and the gift of a name I had reclaimed on my own terms. This journey had cost me more than I could have imagined, but it also showed me a strength I never thought I'd need. I know now that it is never too late to stand up for yourself, to draw a boundary and to find light again, even if it takes time. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminds you of your own or of someone you care about, know that your voice matters and your story is worth telling. I hope you'll share your thoughts below or simply take a moment to honor your own resilience.